When did my life turn into Fight Club? I was 17 when I woke up in a concrete room with blood on my knuckles and no memory of how I got there. My ribs hurt, like someone had used them as a punching bag, and my left eye was swollen shut. The room had metal walls and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling that kept flickering on and off. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't work right, and I ended up falling back against the cold floor. That's when I noticed the dried blood under my fingernails wasn't just mine. It was darker, mixed with dirt, and something else I didn't want to think about. The door opened, and this guy walked in, wearing an expensive suit that didn't match the grimy basement we were in. He looked at me like I was a piece of equipment he was inspecting, then nodded to himself, before leaving without saying a word. A woman came in next with a first aid kit and started cleaning my wounds without making eye contact or explaining anything. She worked fast and efficient, like she'd done this 1,000 times before, wrapping my ribs and putting ice on my eye while I sat there trying to remember anything about the past 12 hours. When I finally made it home 3 hours later, my parents were sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee like it was a normal Saturday morning. My mom looked up when I walked in, covered in bruises and bandages, and all she said was that I needed to be more careful during training. Training for what? I asked, but she just went back to her coffee. My dad told me to go shower and get some rest because I had another session tomorrow night. The way he said it made my stomach turn because there was no concern in his voice, just this flat business tone like he was discussing a work schedule. I stood there in the doorway waiting for one of them to act like actual parents and ask if I was okay, but they just kept drinking their coffee and looking at their phones. That's when I noticed the envelope on the counter with my name on it, stuffed with $100 bills. I counted $3,000 in cash, and when I asked where it came from, my dad said I'd earned it last night. Earned it how? I wanted to scream, but my throat was too raw and my head was pounding too hard to argue. The shower water ran red and brown as I scrubbed dried blood and dirt from my skin. My whole body was covered in bruises I didn't remember getting, and there were cuts on my arms and chest that looked like they came from fingernails. I stood under the hot water for maybe 30 minutes trying to piece together anything from the night before, but there was just this blank space where my memory should be. The last thing I remembered clearly was eating dinner with my parents around 6, and then nothing until waking up in that concrete room. 7 hours just gone, erased, like someone had taken scissors to my brain and cut out a whole chunk of time. I got dressed and went to my room, where I found clothes I didn't recognize folded on my bed. Black pants and a black shirt, both with dark stains that could have been blood or dirt or both. My regular clothes from yesterday were nowhere in the room, probably thrown away or burned or whatever you do with evidence. That word stuck in my head because that's what this felt like, covering up evidence of something I couldn't remember doing. I tried calling my best friend Devin to see if he knew anything about last night, but his mom answered and said he wasn't allowed to talk to me anymore. When I asked why, she just said my parents knew why and hung up. I called 2 more friends and got similar responses, like I'd done something terrible that everyone knew about except me. My phone had messages from numbers I didn't recognize, people congratulating me on my win and asking about next week's match. Match against who? Win at what? I scrolled through the messages, getting more confused and scared with each one. Someone had sent a video file, but when I tried to open it, my phone glitched, and the file disappeared. I threw my phone across the room and it hit the wall, cracking the screen, but I didn't care because nothing was making sense. My mom knocked on my door and came in before I could say anything, sitting on the edge of my bed with this concerned expression that looked fake. She explained that I'd been participating in something important for the family, something that was helping us stay financially stable during difficult times. The way she said it made it sound like I was doing volunteer work, not whatever had left me covered in blood and bruises. She told me I'd been doing this for 3 months now, every Friday and Saturday night. I'd been winning matches against other competitors, earning money that kept our family afloat after my dad lost his job. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. I had no memory of any of it. Not a single fight, not one opponent, nothing. She said the doctor had given me something to help with performance anxiety, something that made me forget the stressful parts, but kept my body's muscle memory intact. I asked what kind of matches required drugs that erased your memory, and she got defensive, saying it was for my own good. Watching people get hurt was traumatic, she said, so the doctors made sure I wouldn't have to carry those memories. But I was the one getting hurt, I pointed out, showing her my bandaged ribs and swollen face. She said sometimes I got hurt, and sometimes the other person did, but either way, I always won. That word always hung in the air like a threat, because if I always won, what happened to the people who lost? My mom stood up and said I needed to rest before tonight's match, then left me alone with my racing thoughts and missing memories. I waited until my parents went to bed, then snuck downstairs to their home office. The door was locked, but I'd learned how to pick it years ago when I was grounded and wanted to use the computer. Inside their filing cabinet, I found a folder with my name on it containing medical records I'd never seen before. Monthly injections of something called Rohypnol, combined with a stimulant I couldn't pronounce. The dates matched up with every Friday and Saturday for the past 3 months, just like my mom had said. There were also bank statements showing deposits of $10,000 every week, way more than the $3,000 I'd found in that envelope. Someone was making serious money off whatever I was doing during those blank hours. I took photos of everything with my cracked phone, then put the folder back exactly how I found it. In the desk drawer, I found business cards for something called the Basement Collective, with an address across town. I pocketed one of the cards and snuck back upstairs, my mind racing with plans I hadn't fully formed yet. Sunday morning came, and my body hurt worse than the day before. New bruises had appeared overnight, dark purple and yellow marks that covered my shoulders and back. I looked like I'd been in a car accident, not a competition or match or whatever sanitized word my parents wanted to use. At breakfast, my dad slid another envelope across the table and told me I'd done excellent work last night. I asked him point blank what exactly I'd done, and he said I'd defended our family's honor against a very skilled opponent. The way he said defended made it sound noble, but the blood on my knuckles told a different story. I asked if the other person was okay, and my parents exchanged this look that answered my question without words. My mom changed the subject to college applications and how my earnings would help pay for whatever school I wanted. Like blood money could buy my way into a future I'd remember. I excused myself from the table and went to my room, where I found more clothes laid out for tonight. This time there was also protective gear, hand wraps, a mouth guard, and something that looked like a chest protector. Whatever I was doing tonight, someone wanted to make sure I could keep doing it. Monday at school, I noticed people staring at me in the hallways. Not the usual kind of staring, but something else. Something that felt like fear, mixed with respect. A kid I'd never talked to before came up to me at lunch and asked for advice on training, saying he'd heard about my record. What record? I asked, and he looked confused like I was joking with him. He said everyone knew about the basement and how I was undefeated in my weight class. I played along and asked him what he knew about it, and he said his older brother tried to get in but failed the entrance evaluation. You had to prove you could really fight, not just talk about it, and most people washed out after one round. The way he talked about it sounded like he was describing a sports league, not whatever nightmare I was apparently part of. I asked where the basement was located, and he looked at me weird before saying I obviously knew since I fought there twice a week. But I didn't know. I wanted to scream. I didn't remember any of it. He walked away looking uncomfortable, and I sat alone for the rest of lunch period trying to figure out my next move. After school, I took the bus to the address on the business card instead of going home. The Basement Collective turned out to be a warehouse in the industrial district, surrounded by other abandoned buildings and empty lots. There were no signs or markers, just a metal door with a camera above it. I knocked and waited, not sure what I expected to happen. A slot in the door opened, and someone asked for my name. When I gave it, the door opened immediately, and a guy built like a professional wrestler gestured for me to come inside. The interior was nothing like I expected. Instead of a dirty warehouse, it was clean and organized with expensive equipment and medical stations set up along the walls. There were training areas with mats and heavy bags, weight rooms with professional gym equipment, and doors leading to other sections I couldn't see. The wrestling guy led me down a hallway lined with photos of fighters, and I stopped dead when I saw my own face on the wall. Underneath my photo was a record: 24 wins, 0 losses, $240,000 earned. I'd been doing this for 3 months twice a week, which meant I'd fought 24 times and had no memory of any of it. The guy took me to an office where a woman in her 50s sat behind a desk covered in paperwork. She looked up when I walked in and smiled like she was greeting an old friend. She called me by a nickname I didn't recognize and asked what brought me by on an off day. I decided to be honest and told her I couldn't remember anything about fighting here, that my parents had been drugging me, and I needed to know what was really going on. Her smile disappeared, and she asked if this was some kind of joke. When I showed her my medical records and the photos I'd taken, her face went pale. She picked up her phone and called someone, speaking in quiet tones about breach of protocol and liability issues. After she hung up, she told me to wait there and not to leave the office under any circumstances. She walked out and locked the door behind her, leaving me alone with my photos on the wall and a growing sense that I'd just made a terrible mistake. Through the walls, I could hear muffled conversations and people moving around quickly, like I'd triggered some kind of emergency response. 30 minutes passed before a different man came into the office, this one wearing a doctor's coat with a name tag that said Dr. Raymond Okafor. He sat down across from me and asked detailed questions about what I remembered and what I didn't, taking notes in a leather journal. When I finished explaining everything, he told me that what my parents had done was completely against the organization's rules. Fighters were supposed to consent to everything and remember their matches, not be drugged into amnesia. He said the basement was technically legal, a sanctioned fighting league for people aged 16 to 25 who wanted to compete for money. The rules were strict. Protective gear required, medical staff on site, fights stopped if someone was seriously injured. But what my parents had arranged was something else entirely, using me as an unconscious weapon while collecting my earnings. Dr. Okafor said he needed to report this to the organization's board and that I should go home and wait for contact. When I asked if I was in trouble, he said no, but my parents definitely were. He gave me his card and told me to call immediately if my parents tried to drug me again or take me anywhere. I left through a different exit and caught the bus home, my mind spinning with new information that somehow made everything worse. My parents were waiting for me when I got home, and their expressions told me they already knew where I'd been. My dad asked what I thought I was doing going to the basement without permission, and I said I was trying to figure out why I couldn't remember fighting there. My mom started crying and said they'd only been trying to protect me from traumatic memories, that watching violence was hard for sensitive people like me. But I wasn't watching it, I shouted back. I was doing it, and there's a difference. My dad told me to lower my voice and show some respect for everything they'd sacrificed to give me this opportunity. What opportunity? I asked, being turned into a puppet who fights for money I never see? That's when he hit me, an open-handed slap across my face that made my ears ring. He'd never hit me before in my entire life, and the shock of it made me step backward into the wall. My mom grabbed his arm and told him to calm down, that violence wasn't the answer. The irony of that statement while I stood there with a fresh handprint on my face wasn't lost on me. I went to my room and locked the door, then pushed my dresser against it for extra security. I called Dr. Okafor from my closet with the lights off and told him what had just happened. He said he was already in contact with social services and the police about my situation. He explained that what my parents had done constituted several crimes: administering drugs to a minor without consent, financial exploitation, and falsifying medical records. The organization was cooperating fully with the investigation because they didn't want to be associated with this kind of abuse. He said I needed to stay calm and safe until authorities arrived, which should be within the next few hours. I asked what would happen to my parents, and he said that wasn't his concern right now. Keeping me safe was the priority. He stayed on the phone with me for the next 2 hours, just talking about random things to keep me distracted. He told me about his own teenage years doing amateur boxing, how the sport had given him discipline and purpose. He said fighting wasn't inherently bad when done correctly with consent and safety measures. What my parents had stolen from me wasn't just money, but my agency and my memories, and that was unforgivable in his opinion. The police arrived around 10 that night with social workers and paramedics. I heard my parents arguing with them downstairs, my mom's voice getting higher and more defensive while my dad tried to stay calm and rational. Someone knocked on my door and identified themselves as Officer Delgado, asking me to come out so they could take my statement. I moved the dresser and opened the door to find 3 officers, 2 women in professional clothes who introduced themselves as social workers, and Dr. Okafor standing in my hallway. They took me downstairs where my parents were sitting on the couch in handcuffs, both of them staring straight ahead and refusing to look at me. One of the social workers, a woman named Patricia Kimura, sat with me at the kitchen table, while Officer Delgado asked me questions about the timeline of events. I showed them the medical records I'd photographed and told them everything I could remember, which wasn't much regarding the actual fights. They took photos of my bruises and injuries, documenting everything with this quiet efficiency that made it feel surreal. Patricia explained that I'd be staying with a foster family temporarily while they investigated the full scope of what had happened. I asked if I could pack some things, and she said yes, but quickly. They needed to get me out of this house tonight. The foster home belonged to a retired couple named Augustus and Flora Wright, who'd been taking in emergency placements for 15 years. Their house was small but clean, and they showed me to a bedroom that had obviously been prepared in advance. Flora made me hot chocolate even though it was late, and we sat in their kitchen while she explained their rules and expectations. No drugs, no violence, no sneaking out, and we all eat dinner together as a family. She didn't ask about my situation or why I was there, just said I was welcome to stay as long as I needed. Augustus was quieter but gave me a firm handshake and said if I needed anything to just ask. They seemed genuinely kind, which made me suspicious because I'd learned that adults who seemed kind usually wanted something. But they just showed me where everything was in the bathroom and said goodnight, leaving me alone in a strange room in a strange house with my whole life in garbage bags. I couldn't sleep that night, just lay there staring at the ceiling and wondering what came next. My phone kept buzzing with messages from my parents' lawyers, but I turned it off and shoved it under the bed. The next morning, Patricia showed up with a different social worker named Kenneth Osei to take me to the hospital for a complete medical examination. They wanted to document everything and run tests to see what drugs were still in my system. The doctor who examined me was thorough and kind, explaining each test before doing it and asking permission even though I was a minor in state custody. The blood work came back showing traces of rohypnol and amphetamines, exactly what I'd seen in those medical records. The doctor said the combination was dangerous and could have caused permanent damage to my liver and kidneys with continued use. He asked if I'd experienced any memory problems beyond the fighting, and I told him about gaps in my memory from the past 3 months, whole days I couldn't fully recall. He said that was consistent with chronic rohypnol exposure, and that my memories might never fully return. The idea that I'd lost 3 months of my life to drugs my own parents gave me made me want to throw up. Patricia held my hand while the doctor continued his examination, checking my ribs and old fractures I hadn't even known were there. He said I'd been fighting with cracked ribs and a partially separated shoulder, injuries that should have kept me in bed, but instead, I'd been drugged up and sent back to fight again. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Within a week, police had raided the Basement Collective and seized their records, showing my parents had signed contracts on my behalf without my knowledge or consent. The organization claimed they'd been deceived, that my parents had presented me as a willing participant who happened to have performance anxiety. But their own records showed red flags they'd ignored, the memory gaps I'd mentioned to their medical staff, The unusual drug regimen my parents insisted on, the way I never spoke during check-ins or remembered previous conversations. Dr. Okafor had actually filed 3 separate reports about concerns with my case, but they'd been dismissed by upper management, who were more interested in the money I was bringing in. 24 fights at $10,000 each meant the organization had profited over $200,000 from my unconscious labor, and they were now facing lawsuits and criminal charges. My parents' lawyer tried to argue they'd been protecting me from trauma, but the medical evidence showed I'd been experiencing the trauma anyway. I just couldn't remember it afterward. The prosecutor explained to me that trauma doesn't disappear just because you can't consciously recall it. It gets buried in your body and nervous system, causing damage that shows up in other ways. Living with Augustus and Flora was weird because they treated me like a normal kid instead of a victim or a case file. Flora taught me how to cook actual meals, not just microwave stuff, and Augustus showed me how to fix things around the house when they broke. They never asked about my past or pushed me to talk about my feelings, just included me in their daily routines like I'd always been there. Flora sang while she cooked, old gospel songs I didn't recognize, and Augustus did crossword puzzles every morning with his coffee. They'd both grown up in rough situations themselves and knew that healing wasn't linear or simple. Patricia visited twice a week to check on me and handle the legal stuff, updating me on the case against my parents and the basement organization. My parents were facing multiple felony charges, including child endangerment, drug-related offenses, and fraud. The basement was being shut down permanently, and several staff members were facing criminal charges for ignoring signs of abuse. I asked Patricia what would happen to the other fighters, and she said most of them were legitimate volunteers who knew what they were signing up for, but they were investigating to make sure there weren't other cases like mine. The nightmares started about 2 weeks into my stay with the Wrights. I'd wake up thrashing and screaming, my body remembering fights my mind couldn't access. Flora would come in and sit on the edge of my bed until I calmed down, never touching me unless I reached for her first, just being present until the terror passed. The dreams were fragments and sensations, the smell of blood and sweat, the sound of bones cracking, the feeling of someone's pulse slowing under my hands. I'd wake up crying and shaking, convinced I'd killed someone even though Patricia assured me that all my opponents had survived. But surviving wasn't the same as being okay, and I carried the weight of knowing I'd hurt people without choosing to, or even remembering it. The therapist Patricia set me up with specialized in trauma and dissociation, helping me understand that what had happened to me was a form of assault. My parents had stolen my consent and my consciousness, using my body as a tool for profit. The therapist said it would take years to fully process everything, but the first step was accepting that none of it was my fault. School was impossible to go back to because everyone knew about the case. The story had made local news, and suddenly, I was that kid whose parents had turned him into a drugged-up fighter. Some people treated me like I was dangerous, crossing to the other side of the hallway when they saw me coming. Others wanted to be my friend specifically because of what had happened, like my trauma made me interesting. I couldn't handle either reaction, so Flora helped me enroll in an online school program where I could work from home. She sat with me during the first few video classes, her presence making it easier to focus and not spiral into anxiety about whether I was actually learning or if the drugs had permanently damaged my ability to remember new information. The teachers were patient and understanding, never pushing me to explain why I was doing school online or asking about my bruises that were slowly fading to yellow and green. Math was hardest because it required sustained focus I couldn't always manage. But English came easier because writing helped me process everything I couldn't say out loud. The preliminary hearing for my parents' case happened 3 months after they were arrested. I had to testify about what I remembered, which wasn't much, but also about the medical records and the money and the way they'd acted when I confronted them. My mom cried through the whole thing, and my dad stared at the table, never once looking at me. Their lawyer tried to paint them as desperate parents who'd made poor choices out of financial necessity, but the prosecutor had bank records showing they'd used my earnings for luxury purchases and expensive vacations. They hadn't been desperate, they'd been greedy. The judge ordered them held without bail until trial, saying they'd demonstrated clear disregard for their child's welfare and posed a continued danger. When the bailiff led them out in chains, my mom tried to catch my eye and mouth something that might have been sorry or son, but I looked away. Patricia squeezed my shoulder and said I'd done good. That telling the truth was brave even when it hurt, but I didn't feel brave. I just felt empty and tired, like I'd run a marathon I never agreed to run. The Basement Collective's owner, a man named Vincent Hartley, took a plea deal and agreed to testify against my parents in exchange for reduced charges. He provided detailed records of every fight I'd participated in, including video footage that I'd never have to watch if I didn't want to. Patricia said the videos proved beyond doubt that I'd been unconscious of my surroundings even while fighting, my eyes unfocused and my movements purely instinctual. Medical experts testified that the drug combination created a state where my body functioned, but my conscious mind was essentially offline. It was like sleepwalking, except instead of walking, I was fighting trained opponents and winning every time. The prosecutor called it one of the most disturbing cases of parental exploitation she'd seen in 20 years. During the breaks, I sat in a victim's advocate room drinking bad coffee and trying not to think about the fact that I'd hurt 24 people and couldn't remember their faces or names. Patricia arranged for me to write apology letters to each opponent if I wanted to, even though legally I wasn't responsible for my actions. I spent weeks working on those letters, trying to explain something I didn't understand myself. The trial lasted 2 weeks and was covered by multiple news outlets. They used my case as an example of how underground fighting leagues needed better regulation and oversight, even when they claimed to be legitimate operations. Expert witnesses testified about the long-term effects of Rohypnol and how the combination of drugs I'd been given could have killed me multiple times. My parents' defense argued that they'd relied on medical advice from Dr. Hartley's staff and didn't understand the full risks, but text messages between them and Hartley showed they'd specifically requested the memory-erasing drugs so I wouldn't refuse to keep fighting. The jury took less than 4 hours to find them guilty on all counts. My mom collapsed when the verdicts were read, and my dad just nodded like he'd expected it. Sentencing was scheduled for a month later, giving both sides time to prepare arguments about appropriate punishment. Patricia explained that they'd likely get between 10 and 20 years each, possibly more depending on the judge's view of the case. I asked if I had to be there for sentencing, and she said no, I'd already done my part by testifying. I chose to attend anyway because I needed to see it through to the end. The courtroom was packed with reporters and families of other fighters and people who'd followed the case. The judge spent 30 minutes explaining her reasoning before announcing the sentences: 18 years for my father, 15 years for my mother, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. She said they'd betrayed the most fundamental duty parents have to protect their children, and their crimes had been calculated and sustained over months. My mom sobbed while my dad sat stone-faced, staring at nothing. The judge asked if I wanted to address the court before they were taken away, and I stood up even though my legs were shaking. I told my parents that what they'd taken from me wasn't just money or time, but my ability to trust that the people who were supposed to love me actually did. I said I forgave them because carrying hatred would only hurt me more, but forgiveness didn't mean I'd ever see them again or welcome them back into my life. My mom tried to say something, but her lawyer stopped her. The bailiffs led them out, and I watched them go, feeling nothing except maybe relief that it was finally over. Recovery wasn't a straight line because trauma doesn't work that way. Some days I felt almost normal, going to therapy and doing schoolwork and helping Flora with dinner. Other days I couldn't get out of bed because the weight of everything felt too heavy to carry. The nightmares continued but gradually became less frequent, dropping from every night to a few times a week. Augustus taught me woodworking in his garage workshop, saying having something to do with my hands helped quiet the mind. He was right about that. I started building small boxes and picture frames, sanding the wood until it was smooth and perfect, finding peace in the repetitive motions. Flora framed my school achievements and hung them in the hallway, treating my online GED progress like it was just as important as any traditional diploma. They never formally adopted me, but after 6 months, they asked if I wanted to stop calling them Mr. and Mrs. Wright and just use their first names. It felt like accepting membership in a family I'd chosen instead of one I'd been born into. The money from my fights sat in a frozen account while lawyers argued about who it belonged to. Eventually, the court decided it was mine since I'd earned it through my labor, even if that labor had been coerced. After legal fees and restitution to my opponents, I had about $150,000 left. Patricia helped me set up a trust that I couldn't access until I turned 21, money for college or starting a business or whatever future I wanted to build. I told her I wanted to donate half of it to organizations that helped kids in foster care, keeping only what I'd need for practical expenses. She said that was admirable, but I should think about it more, that I'd earned that money even if the circumstances were horrible. But keeping money earned through violence I couldn't remember felt wrong, like being paid for someone else's work. We compromised on donating a third to charity and saving the rest for my education. The university I applied to gave me a full scholarship anyway, specifically for students aging out of foster care, so the money ended up going toward an apartment and living expenses instead. 2 years after everything happened, I was living in a small apartment near campus, studying psychology, because I wanted to understand trauma and help other people process theirs. The Wrights visited monthly, bringing Flora's famous sweet potato pie and Augustus's terrible dad jokes. I'd published a piece in a journal about surviving parental exploitation without naming my parents or specific details about my case. The responses were overwhelming. Dozens of messages from people who'd experienced different types of abuse, but recognized their own stories in mine. My therapist said helping others was part of how I was reclaiming my narrative and building meaning from suffering. I still couldn't remember those 3 months of fighting, and probably never would, but I'd stopped waiting for the memories to return. The person I'd been during those fights wasn't me, just a puppet made from my body and someone else's chemicals. The real me was the one choosing to move forward, to build something good from something terrible, to prove that what happened to you doesn't have to define who you become. I never went back to visit my parents in prison because forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. They sent letters occasionally through their lawyer, asking how I was doing and saying they were getting help and taking responsibility. I read the letters once, then filed them away, not responding but not burning them either, just acknowledging they existed and moving on. The kid who woke up in that concrete room with blood on his knuckles was gone, replaced by someone who understood that strength wasn't about fighting, but about choosing kindness when cruelty would be easier. My life had turned into Fight Club without my consent, but unlike the movie, my way out wasn't through destruction and chaos. It was through therapy and education, and the quiet work of healing one day at a time. Augustus told me once that surviving something isn't the same as letting it define you, and he was right about that. I'd survived, and now I was living, and those were two completely different things. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave your take below.